The late 19th century in southern Africa presented a landscape of vast plains and towering mountains, poised on the cusp of profound transformation. This era was fundamentally shaped by an insatiable drive for imperial expansion, a pursuit fueled by the relentless quest for valuable resources and the strategic desire to consolidate power across continents. The region's inherent dynamism and the significant internal shifts it was undergoing rendered it particularly susceptible to external influence. When an expansionist power like the British Empire, driven by resource acquisition and political consolidation, encountered such a fluid and changing environment, it created fertile ground for intervention and conflict. The transformation unfolding in southern Africa was not merely an organic evolution. It was a process ripe for deliberate manipulation and acceleration by imperial ambitions, setting the stage for an almost inevitable clash of vastly different cultures, worldviews, and aspirations. The British Empire, a dominion whose reach spanned continents, began to cast its ambitious gaze upon southern Africa. A pivotal discovery of diamonds in South Africa significantly amplified British interests, transforming the region from a distant outpost into a focal point of global attention and intense competition. The background of the conflict directly links British interests to the desire for the Zulu population to provide labor in these lucrative diamond fields. The initial diamond discoveries in 1871, for instance, drew approximately 50,000 people to Kimberley, marking the genesis of a long series of mining booms that would eventually establish South Africa as the wealthiest country on the continent. This newfound mineral wealth also financed one of the most comprehensive systems of racial segregation in the world. Indeed, control over these diamond fields was instrumental in accumulating the vast fortune of figures like Cecil Rhodes and directly financed the creation of the British South Africa Company. The British vision for southern Africa was encapsulated in an ambitious plan of confederation, aiming to unite various British colonies, Boer republics, and independent African groups under a single, British-controlled administration. This grand scheme was largely driven by economic motivations, seeking to secure the region's vast mineral wealth and ensure imperial dominance. The economic imperative arising from the discovery of diamonds was not just one motivation among many. It was the fundamental economic engine behind British imperial aggression in the region. This transformed a previously peripheral interest into a central focus of imperial ambition, directly leading to the aggressive policies that ultimately triggered the war. While the concept of confederation might outwardly appear as a benign administrative objective, a deeper examination reveals its true strategic purpose. The plan aimed to destroy autonomous African states by bringing them under common control, explicitly, with a view to implementing a policy of economic development. This unification was intended to ensure the safety of the precious minerals. Thus, confederation was a strategic political maneuver designed to dismantle existing indigenous power structures and ensure unimpeded access to and control over the region's mineral wealth and labor. It was an imposed unification, rather than a mutually desired one, a characteristic that would inherently sow the seeds for widespread instability and future conflicts beyond the Anglo-Zulu War itself. Within this landscape of burgeoning colonial ambition, stood a formidable and self-reliant power, the Zulu Kingdom. Under the astute leadership of King Cetshwayo, the Zulu had meticulously forged a highly organized and militarily potent society. Their strength and independence presented a striking contrast to the often fragmented indigenous groups the British had encountered and easily subdued elsewhere. This was not merely a tribal entity, it was a sophisticated kingdom, deeply rooted in its own established traditions, with a powerful sense of collective identity and a formidable military structure. King Cetshwayo steadfastly refused to submit to British control. In 1878, the total Zulu population, estimated at approximately 350,000 people, was capable of fielding a formidable army of around 44,000 warriors. The very existence of a powerful, independent African state like the Zulu Kingdom directly challenged the prevailing British imperial narrative. This narrative often portrayed Britain as bringing civilization to backward, or primitive, peoples. The Zulus' profound self-reliance and their highly organized military system contradicted this implicit justification for British rule. Their continued sovereignty was perceived not merely as a military obstacle but as an ideological affront, making their subjugation a necessary prerequisite not just for territorial control, but for the perceived legitimacy and moral authority of the imperial project itself. The British Grand Scheme for Southern Africa aimed to unify diverse British colonies, independent Boer republics, and various African groups under a single, cohesive British-controlled administration. Lord Carnarvon, the London-based Secretary of State for the Colonies, actively supported the imposition of this confederation scheme, viewing it as a straightforward means to unite the region and prevent independent African states from forming a united front against British rule. However, this plan was far from universally accepted and was met with strong resistance from local groups. The Cape government, for example, rejected it as an attempt to override their constitution and extend British imperial control, foreseeing potential conflicts. The Afrikaners, too, harbored deep resentment over the recent annexation of the Transvaal and did not support the Confederation, a sentiment that would later culminate in the First Boer War. The British vision for Confederation was thus an unpopular system, imposed from the outside, rather than an organic unification. This top-down approach, driven by British imperial interests, inherently contained the seeds of widespread instability and future conflicts that would extend beyond the Anglo-Zulu War itself. The resistance from various local groups demonstrated a clear understanding that this was a move to consolidate British power and resources, not a collaborative effort for regional stability. At the very heart of this aggressive policy stood Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner appointed in 1877. Frere was a seasoned colonial administrator who arrived in South Africa with an unwavering determination to implement the Confederation scheme. He quickly identified the independent Zulu Kingdom, with its formidable military and self-reliant character, as the principal impediment to his vision for a unified, British-dominated region. Frere's focus on King Cetshwayo bordered on an obsession, as he succumbed to fevered imagination of impending Zulu invasions of Natal, despite evidence to the contrary. Despite explicit caution from his superiors in London, who were preoccupied with broader global responsibilities and wary of new conflicts, Frere actively sought a justification for war. He was told, in no uncertain terms, to treat the Zulu with a spirit of forbearance, but disregarded this official disapproval, his plans too far advanced to be deterred. He seized upon minor border incursions and a domestic incident involving a Zulu chief, Siheo Kazango, whose wives had crossed into Natal and were subsequently killed by his son. Frere exaggerated these events, portraying them as grave violations of British territory and moral principles, providing a pretext for starting a war, a cloak to cover naked British aggression. He systematically demonized King Cetshwayo, describing him as a bloodthirsty tyrant, based on hearsay and missionary accounts, thereby constructing a narrative that justified British intervention as a civilizing mission rather than an act of conquest. This systematic fabrication of a crisis and the demonization of the Zulu leadership were classic colonial tactics. Such actions served to justify British aggression to the domestic public, garner support for a war that was initially unpopular in London, and framed the invasion as a benevolent imposition of civilization, rather than a blatant land grab. This strategic misrepresentation is a recurring pattern in the history of imperial expansion. This manufactured crisis culminated in the delivery of an impossible ultimatum to King Cetshwayo on December 11, 1878. The demands were meticulously crafted to be rejected. Cetshwayo was required to disband his army and unequivocally forsake his sovereignty. This was a deliberate provocation, a calculated move by Frere to force a conflict that he believed was essential to achieve British imperial objectives. London was not fully briefed by Frere and initially was not in the mood for war, but the arrival of the news of the defeat at Isandlwana galvanized the British government into a full-scale campaign to save face. Frere was later censured by Whitehall for acting recklessly, though he was initially supported by Prime Minister Beaconsfield before being recalled by Gladstone's ministry. The sequence of events illustrates how individual agency, combined with a fervent ideological conviction, could override broader strategic caution within a vast imperial bureaucracy. Frere's actions, taken against the explicit caution of his superiors in London, demonstrate that a powerful, determined individual on the ground could effectively force the hand of a distant, preoccupied government. He circumvented opposition by timing his letters to take advantage of the delay in mail between London and Cape Town. This highlights the decentralized and sometimes rogue nature of imperial expansion, leading to intentionally provoked conflicts that London had initially sought to avoid. In stark contrast to Frere's aggressive portrayal, King Cetshwayo genuinely desired peace with the British Empire. He was acutely aware of the immense power of the Great White Queen's realm, which stretched around the globe. His refusal to comply with the ultimatum was not an act of aggression, but a principled defense of his kingdom's long-standing independence and sovereignty. Cetshwayo had initially pursued a policy of holding back his troops and remaining defensive, hoping to negotiate a settlement. He even offered to make a payment for his perceived offense. However, the British wanted war, and were not satisfied with any response that did not infringe upon Zulu's sovereignty. The ultimatum delivered to King Cetshwayo was not a genuine attempt at diplomacy or a pathway to peaceful resolution. Instead, it was a carefully constructed, thinly veiled declaration of war, meticulously crafted to be impossible to satisfy. Cetshwayo's attempts to find a peaceful solution, including agreeing to British demands that did not compromise Zulu's sovereignty, were ultimately rejected because the British had already decided on war. This underscores the predetermined intent to dismantle Zulu's sovereignty, regardless of Cetshwayo's efforts to maintain peace. The Zulu military system was a highly organized and disciplined force, a stark contrast to the chaotic tribal levies often depicted by colonial powers. At its core was the impi, a term referring to a body of men gathered for war, or the army itself. These impis were comprised of regiments, known as amabutho, which were drawn from large, militarized homesteads called amakanda. This structure demonstrated a sophisticated statecraft that seamlessly integrated military training and readiness into the fabric of daily life. Young men were incorporated into age-set regiments, amabutho, through a system of ukabuthwa, to be enrolled, ensuring continuous training and the ability to assemble an effective force at short notice. In addition to military duties, these young men were involved in maintaining barracks and performing duties for the royal household, including crop production and tending national herds. The foundations of this formidable military were laid by Shaka Zulu, who revolutionized traditional tribal warfare in southern Africa. His key innovations included the Ikawa, a short stabbing spear designed purely for devastating close-quarters combat, and the large Isolanga shield, used in coordinated attacks for both defense and offense. The Zulus' most iconic and devastating tactical formation was the Impondo Zankamo, or Horns of the Buffalo. This crescent-shaped attack layout was composed of 4 distinct elements: the chest, the central main force of prime fighters designed to deliver the decisive frontal assault; the horns, left and right, flanking elements typically made up of younger, faster men, moving swiftly to encircle and pin the enemy, often remaining out of sight until the last moment; and the loins, a sizable reserve, often comprising older veterans, held out of sight behind the main body to exploit success, reinforce weak points, or provide stability. Zulu tactics emphasized speed and precision. They would approach an enemy in huge columns, then rapidly deploy into the encircling formation, advancing at a steady jogging speed and completing the final attack at a run. Crucially, Zulu warriors were masters of their environment, making excellent use of cover, concealment, and terrain masking to reduce their exposure to fire and approach unseen, thereby negating the British advantage in long-range firepower. While the Zulus had acquired a significant number of firearms by 1878, estimated at 20,000 serviceable firearms, including some modern breech loaders, they generally made little effective use of them. Their marksmanship training was minimal, and they often fired inaccurately or used guns as a preliminary volley before dropping them and charging with their traditional spears and clubs. Their primary strength remained in discipline, close-quarters combat, where their ikawa and shields were devastatingly effective. The Zulu army required relatively little in the way of commissariat or transport compared to the British. Each regiment was typically accompanied by 3 or 4 days' provisions, consisting of maize or millet and a herd of beef cattle. Important pre-war ceremonies also took place at the king's royal homestead, where various medicines and drugs, like cannabis and other narcotics, referred to as powders or muti, were administered to warriors. These were intended to enhance fighting capacity and encourage the belief that they would be immune from British firepower, adding a significant psychological dimension to their readiness. The Zulu also maintained an elaborate system of spies and intelligence, knowing exactly where the British were and reporting their every move. The Zulu military system was a highly evolved and optimized system for its specific environment. Their mastery of the landscape and their ability to use cover, concealment, and terrain masking to approach unseen were critical. This demonstrates a profound adaptive intelligence, as they understood their terrain and their enemy's strengths, long-range firepower, and weaknesses, rigidity, developing tactics, speed, encirclement, concealment, and close-quarters combat that directly countered those strengths. This reveals a sophisticated understanding of asymmetric warfare, often underestimated by their colonial adversaries. The pre-war ceremonies and the administration of powders to warriors also highlight a powerful, often overlooked, psychological component of Zulu military effectiveness. This was not solely about physical training or tactical formations but about instilling a profound sense of invincibility and collective resolve through ritual and belief, contributing significantly to their ferocity in battle and their willingness to charge into seemingly overwhelming fire. In contrast, the British military relied heavily on well-aimed rifle volley fire, supported by rockets, artillery, and later in the campaign, Gatling guns. Their standard battle tactic was to form a square or entrench their position, expecting the Zulus to charge directly into their overwhelming firepower. The British and colonial troops were armed with the modern Martini-Henry breech-loading rifle, and their artillery included 7-pounder mountain guns and hail rocket batteries. The Royal Artillery deployed both 7-pounder and 9-pounder field guns, with the lighter 7-pounders preferred for mobility in Zululand. Hale's Pattern 9 and 24-pounder rockets were also used, though they were considered unreliable and often inaccurate. This fundamental mismatch in tactical assumptions, where the British expected a conventional European-style engagement, would prove disastrous in the early stages of the war. The British viewed their own military as inherently modern and superior, while categorizing the Zulu system as traditional or primitive. Their reliance on technological superiority alone, without adapting their tactics to the unique terrain and enemy, proved to be a critical strategic flaw. This overconfidence, rooted in technological advantage, led to a rigid adherence to established doctrine, which proved disastrous against an adaptive, unconventional foe. The early defeats served as a brutal awakening to the fact that technological advantage does not automatically translate to victory without appropriate tactical adaptation. The British, despite their global power and technological superiority, consistently underestimated the Zulu. This was not merely a series of tactical oversights, it was a deeply ingrained systemic flaw, rooted in imperial arrogance and a pervasive racial bias. Lord Chelmsford, the British commander-in-chief, for example, held a low opinion of African military potential and assumed his main problem would be bringing the enemy to battle. The Zulus' profound self-reliance and their highly organized military system directly challenged the British narrative of bringing civilization to backward peoples. This fundamental misperception led to catastrophic misjudgments on the part of British commanders and policymakers, setting the stage for unexpected and devastating defeats. The profound underestimation of the Zulus' capabilities, their strategic acumen, and their unwavering resolve proved to be a critical causal factor in the initial British setbacks. This racial bias was not just a moral failing but a significant strategic blind spot. It prevented British commanders from accurately assessing the Zulus' capabilities, leading directly to a failure to gather proper intelligence, adequately entrench camps, or adapt their tactics. This bias transformed into a critical strategic flaw, directly causing catastrophic misjudgments and initial defeats, underscoring how non-military, ideological factors can profoundly impact military outcomes and lead to self-inflicted wounds. Lord Chelmsford, the British Commander-in-Chief, initiated the invasion of Zululand with an overwhelming sense of confidence. His plan involved dividing his forces into 5 columns, aiming to converge on the Zulu capital. His fatal flaw, however, was an acute underestimation of the Zulus' capabilities and a critical failure to implement adequate defensive measures. This profound misjudgment stemmed from a pervasive imperial arrogance and a racial bias that prevented him from recognizing the Zulu as a sophisticated military adversary. Chelmsford, a product of his time and class, had a low opinion of African military potential and assumed his main problem in Zululand would be simply bringing the enemy to battle. On January 20, 1879, Chelmsford's main column established camp at the foot of Isandlwana Mountain. Despite established British military doctrine and repeated warnings from his senior staff and South African Boers that a Zulu camp was nearby and defenses were needed, the camp was not properly entrenched or formed into a defensive laager. This critical oversight left the British forces dangerously exposed. This failure to implement basic defensive measures, a standard military practice, was a direct consequence of the prevailing imperial mindset that viewed indigenous forces as inherently inferior and incapable of sophisticated military strategy, or overwhelming numerical attacks. The unprepared British camp thus stood as a powerful symbolic manifestation of British hubris and their belief in inherent superiority against an indigenous foe. On the morning of January 22, 1879, Chelmsford made a catastrophic decision. Believing he was pursuing the main Zulu army, he led a significant portion of his troops away from the camp, leaving the remaining force, approximately 1,500 men, under the command of Colonel Pouliane and Colonel Durnford. This division critically weakened the British position, a tactical blunder rooted in flawed intelligence and overconfidence. Unbeknownst to Chelmsford, the main Zulu army, numbering between 20,000 and 25,000 warriors, was bivouacked just 6 miles away. They had not intended to attack that day, but a British picket patrol stumbled upon them, forcing the Zulu to launch an immediate, unplanned assault. Despite the unexpected nature of the engagement, the Zulu impis swiftly deployed their devastating horns of the buffalo formation, rapidly encircling the exposed British camp. The right horn, in particular, executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, slipping unnoticed behind Isandlwana Mountain and effectively cutting off the British retreat. This remarkable tactical flexibility and effective command and control, even in an unexpected, rapidly unfolding engagement, directly contradicted colonial narratives of chaotic tribal levies. It highlighted the sophisticated training and discipline of the Zulu, allowing them to execute complex maneuvers on the fly and exploit British vulnerabilities. The British forces, spread thin and lacking proper defenses, were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers and ferocity of the Zulu attack. Ammunition shortages and critical tactical mistakes exacerbated their collapse. By mid-afternoon, the battle was a near annihilation. Approximately 1,700 colonial troops were killed, including 52 officers and 727 white soldiers. The Zulu, adhering to their custom, took no prisoners, a brutal but deliberate act that maximized the terror and psychological impact of their victory, aiming to break the enemy's will. Zulu casualties were also heavy, estimated between 1,500 and 5,000. Isandlwana represented one of the worst defeats in British military history. It shattered the myth of European military invincibility in Africa and delivered a profound shock to imperial confidence. The outcome had lasting implications, notably leading to British regiments no longer carrying their colours into combat. This disaster was a direct, causal outcome of ingrained hubris and the resulting strategic and tactical negligence. Chelmsford suffered a nervous collapse in the aftermath and made serious efforts to shift the blame onto others, also failing to bury the British dead. The catastrophic outcome at Isandlwana served as a direct and brutal refutation of British overconfidence, demonstrating how hubris could lead to fatal negligence. In the immediate wake of their stunning victory at Isandlwana, some 4,000 Zulu reserves, under the command of the impetuous Prince Dabilamanzi Compand, defied King Cetshwayo's orders and advanced towards Rorke's Drift. This small Swedish mission station served as a British garrison and hospital, strategically protecting a river crossing into Natal. At Rorke's Drift, Lieutenant J. R. M. Chard and Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead found themselves with a meager force of fewer than 150 British and colonial soldiers. Alerted to the approaching Zulu impi, they hastily began fortifying the mission compound. They constructed makeshift barricades from any available materials, including heavy 200-pound mail-eye bags and biscuit boxes, reinforcing a waist-high stone fence, and loopholing the buildings for defense. They also prepared their limited ammunition, opening reserve boxes to ensure they had enough for a desperate stand. The Zulu attack commenced around 4:30 p.m. on January 22, 1879, and raged for over 5 intense hours. The Zulu warriors launched furious and intense assaults, attempting to scale the hastily erected barricades. The British defenders, armed with Martini Henry rifles and long bayonets, fired with disciplined volleys into the advancing masses. The Martini Henry rifle proved superbly effective, and this close-quarters defensive fighting, its range and stopping power maximized by the confined space. Despite being nearly overwhelmed, at times, the small British force displayed remarkable resilience. They inflicted heavy losses on the Zulu, with approximately 500 Zulu warriors killed or wounded, while suffering remarkably low casualties themselves, only 15 killed and 12 seriously wounded. The Zulu ultimately withdrew shortly before dawn on January 23, their repeated charges having failed to breach the determined British defense. While the Battle of Rorke's Drift held minimal strategic significance in the broader war, its outcome was a profound, moral victory for the British. It became a powerful symbol of British military valor and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The awarding of 11 Victoria Crosses, the most for a single action by one regiment, further cemented its legendary status. Crucially, it provided much-needed propaganda to counter the Zulu success at Isandlwana, helping to restore shattered British pride and morale. This highlights the profound power of narrative control in wartime, particularly in maintaining domestic support for costly conflicts. A small tactical success was amplified and leveraged into a massive narrative win, diverting attention from the systemic failures at Isandlwana. The stark contrast between the British disaster at Isandlwana and their successful defense at Rorke's Drift reveals a critical limitation in British military doctrine at the time. Their forces were highly effective in static, defensive positions where their superior firepower could be maximized against massed attacks. However, they were rigid and vulnerable in open field engagements against the fluid, mobile, and encircling tactics of the Zulu. This suggests that their training and assumptions were effective in specific, controlled scenarios but dangerously inadequate in others. The success at Rorke's Drift was contingent on the British being able to fight on their terms, from a prepared, defensible position, a lesson they were slow to fully grasp across their empire. The shock of Isandlwana reverberated throughout the British Empire, but it also spurred a determined and overwhelming response. Massive reinforcements were swiftly dispatched to South Africa. Lord Chelmsford, though his reputation was severely tarnished, was given another opportunity to lead the renewed offensive, a testament to the Empire's resolve to correct its earlier missteps. The British military, chastened by their initial defeats, began a slow but crucial process of adapting their tactics. They increasingly emphasized the use of fortified camps, defensive lagers, and more cautious, deliberate advances. This strategic shift allowed them to leverage their technological superiority and overwhelming logistical capacity more effectively, forcing the Zulu to attack prepared positions where British firepower could be maximized. This highlights that significant military reform, especially within a rigid imperial structure, often requires the brutal catalyst of painful failure. Isandlwana forced the British to abandon their initial hubris and adopt defensive strategies that maximized their technological advantage. This was not a pre-planned evolution but a reactive, high-cost learning process, demonstrating that even a seemingly invincible imperial military machine could be forced to learn and evolve by an underestimated foe. The Battle of Kambula, on March 29, 1879, proved to be a decisive turning point in the war and a significant British victory. A large Zulu force, estimated at 22,000 warriors, launched a determined attack on a meticulously fortified British position at Kambula. The British camp featured a strong hexagonal laager of wagons, a separate kraal for cattle, extensive trenches, earth parapets, and a stone redoubt, all defended by strategically placed artillery. The British forces, under Colonel Evelyn Wood, used their 7-pounder guns and concentrated rifle fire with devastating effect. The Zulus, despite their unwavering courage and repeated charges, saw the head of each charge shot away by the relentless British fire. Kambula was a severe Zulu defeat, resulting in heavy casualties, estimated between 758 and 2,000 killed, with some historians recording 2,000 fatalities, against minimal British losses, 29 killed and 54 wounded. Crucially, this battle basically broke the willpower of the Zulu army to attack the British in force again until the Battle of Ulundi, marking a significant erosion of their fighting spirit and collective resolve. Shortly after Kambula, at the Battle of Ginginlovu on April 2, 1879, a British relief column under Lord Chelmsford, comprising over 5,600 European and African soldiers, along with Gatling guns and rocket tubes, was attacked by a 10,000-strong Zulu impi. The British had formed a strong laager, wagon square, with trenches and an earth wall, providing a formidable defensive perimeter. They repelled the Zulu assault with superior firepower, the Gatling guns proving particularly effective in mowing down the charging warriors. This British victory restored Chelmsford's confidence and allowed for the successful relief of the besieged Esho garrison. Zulu casualties were substantial, around 1,100 dead and wounded, against minimal British losses. These battles, particularly Kambula, marked the true shift in the war's momentum. The Zulu, despite their bravery and tactical skill, could not sustain the immense losses inflicted by concentrated British firepower against fortified positions. The British logistical superiority, their ability to bring overwhelming force to bear, and their slow but steady adaptation of tactics began to decisively turn the tide of the conflict. The battles of Kambula and Ginginlovu, characterized by high Zulu casualties against relatively low British losses, provided an early, brutal glimpse into the attritional nature of future industrial warfare. These engagements demonstrated that even immense courage, discipline, and tactical skill, as displayed by the Zulu charges, could not overcome the sheer destructive power of concentrated, entrenched industrial weaponry. This marked a significant shift from decisive, maneuver-based battles to grinding engagements where the sheer number of casualties inflicted became a primary determinant of victory, foreshadowing the horrors of conflicts like World War I. With the Zulu military significantly weakened and their morale eroded by the defeats at Kambula and Ginginlovu, Lord Chelmsford launched his final, decisive advance towards Ulundi, the Zulu capital. His force was immense, comprising approximately 1,000 regular cavalry, 9,000 regular infantry, and 7,000 additional men with 24 guns, including the newly introduced Gatling guns. This overwhelming force was a testament to the Empire's determination to crush the Zulu resistance once and for all. As the British approached, King Cetshwayo, recognizing the dire situation, attempted to negotiate for peace, offering oxen and elephant tusks. However, Chelmsford, now supremely confident of victory and intent on total subjugation, rejected these terms, demanding the unconditional surrender of a Zulu regiment. This uncompromising stance signaled the British intent to completely dismantle the Zulu military and political structure, leaving no room for negotiation or continued sovereignty. The last major engagement of the Anglo-Zulu War took place on July 4, 1879, at the Battle of Ulundi. The British forces formed a hollow square formation, a classic defensive tactic designed to maximize firepower in all directions. Mounted troops under Colonel Buller skillfully provoked the Zulu impis into attacking, then retreated into the safety of the square, drawing the Zulu into a killing zone. The Zulu warriors charged with their characteristic bravery and ferocity, managing to get within 20 to 30 meters of the British square. However, they faltered under the heavy British fire, unable to break through the concentrated volleys of Martini Henry rifles and the relentless, rapid fire of the Gatling guns. Their reserves failed to support the main assault, leaving the attacking regiments isolated and vulnerable. The British cavalry then pursued and routed the fleeing Zulus, ensuring their complete dispersal. This decisive victory resulted in devastating Zulu casualties, with over 1,000 warriors killed, while British losses were minimal, with only 3 officers and 10 men killed. Following the battle, the British proceeded to capture and burn the royal kraal of Ondini, the Zulu capital. This act was a powerful symbolic gesture, signifying the complete destruction of the Zulu Kingdom's military and political power. King Cetshwayo, the last independent Zulu monarch, fled after the defeat but was eventually captured in August and exiled to the Cape. In the aftermath, General Sir Garnet Wolseley, who had taken over overall command from Chelmsford, implemented a policy to pacify Zululand by dividing it into 13 separate chiefdoms. These kinglets were often granted to pliant chiefs who had collaborated with the British, such as John Donne, with King Cetshwayo explicitly denied any chiefdom. This fragmentation was a deliberate strategy to prevent the resurgence of a unified and powerful Zulu state. The Battle of Ulundi demonstrated that once the British military adapted its tactics and brought its full logistical and technological might to bear, the Zulu, despite their courage and tactical skill, could not withstand the onslaught. This highlights the ultimate, decisive advantage of an industrial empire over a pre-industrial kingdom in a prolonged, conventional conflict, where the ability to project and sustain massive firepower eventually overwhelms even the most determined resistance. The British victory was not about establishing a stable, unified region but about dismantling the existing power structure to prevent future challenges. By appointing pliant chiefs and creating internal divisions, the British ensured that any future Zulu resistance would be fragmented and less effective. This strategy had devastating long-term social and political consequences, demonstrating how colonial powers often prioritized control and resource extraction over genuine stability or the well-being of the indigenous population. The Anglo-Zulu War, a brief yet brutal conflict, left an indelible mark on southern Africa and resonated far beyond its borders. Its conclusion brought about profound and lasting consequences for both the Zulu people and the British Empire, while also serving as a stark precedent for future conflicts. The immediate aftermath of the war saw the Zulu Kingdom systematically dismantled and divided into 13 separate chiefdoms. This deliberate fragmentation, a policy of pacification through division, led to prolonged civil war and bitter rivalry among Zulu factions, profoundly undermining their economic and social cohesion. The destruction of the Zulu Kingdom was not a single, instantaneous event but a protracted process of internal destabilization, ensuring that the imposed peace was not true reconciliation but a deliberate act of political destabilization designed to maintain British control. This strategy of divide and rule, while achieving immediate British objectives, created deep internal divisions that would plague the Zulu people for years, hindering their ability to resist further colonial encroachment. Despite the military defeat, the capture of their king, and the political fragmentation of their kingdom, the Anglo-Zulu War paradoxically strengthened a deep sense of Zulu identity and nationalism. This enduring sense of identity and defiance would influence future anti-colonial movements and struggles for independence in South Africa. This outcome demonstrates that military conquest and political subjugation do not necessarily extinguish cultural or national identity. Instead, such experiences can often galvanize a people, fostering a more unified sense of self, and laying the groundwork for future resistance movements against colonial rule. The very attempt to fragment the Zulus served to rally them to their king's cause, demonstrating a resilience that defied colonial expectations. From the British perspective, the war, despite the ultimate victory, was widely regarded as an embarrassing and expensive sideshow. The catastrophic defeat at Isandlwana, in particular, was a profound shock to imperial confidence and a significant blow to British prestige on the global stage. The war served as a critical, albeit painful, test for British military reforms. It highlighted the urgent need for adaptation in colonial warfare, particularly regarding marksmanship, tactics against irregular forces, and the importance of logistics. While some lessons were slow to be fully integrated, the experience contributed to the evolution of British military thinking and training. The initial defeats revealed vulnerabilities within their military strategies and challenged their perception as an invincible colonial power. The Anglo-Zulu War was part of a larger wave of European imperial expansion across Africa. It occurred at a time when Britain's strategic focus was shifting to the Suez Canal and Egypt, making South Africa, prior to the major gold discoveries of the 1880s, somewhat of an economic backwater. This context reveals that even a seemingly minor colonial war could have significant internal repercussions for the empire, challenging its self-perception and prompting re-evaluations of its global responsibilities. The military victory at Ulundi, which led to the dismantling of the Zulu Kingdom, did not result in a stable or easily managed territory. Instead, the imposed division of Zululand directly led to prolonged internal Zulu strife and a fragmented region that required continued oversight and intervention. This highlights a recurring pattern in imperial history. Military success often fails to translate into political stability or ease of administration, frequently creating new, unforeseen challenges and perpetuating cycles of conflict. The Anglo-Zulu War, much like the later Boer Wars, served as a brutal laboratory for modern warfare. It showcased the devastating impact of industrial weaponry when effectively deployed, the critical importance of adapting tactics to specific terrain and enemy strengths, and the profound psychological dimensions of conflict. The tactics of divide and rule, and the systematic suppression of indigenous power through political fragmentation would become hallmarks of colonial administration across the continent. This conflict, therefore, provided a template for how industrialized powers would engage with and manage resistance in their vast empires, influencing future colonial strategies and military engagements. The long-term consequences of the Anglo-Zulu War extended far beyond the immediate military and political outcomes. The fragmentation of the Zulu Kingdom into 13 chiefdoms, while intended to pacify the region, instead plunged Zululand into a period of intense civil strife. These imposed boundaries and the elevation of certain chiefs over others, often those who had collaborated with the British, ignited bitter power struggles and internal conflicts that lasted for years. This internal disunity severely hampered the Zulu people's ability to resist further British encroachment and exploitation, effectively weakening them from within. The economic impact was also profound. The traditional Zulu agricultural and pastoral systems were disrupted, and the region became increasingly integrated into the colonial economy, often on unfavorable terms. This laid the groundwork for the later dispossession of land and the forced labor systems that would characterize apartheid-era South Africa. The British confiscated large areas of Zulu territory, depriving the Zulu people of their ancestral lands and economic base, leading to population displacement and forced migration to urban areas or reserves. The ensuing civil war among the Zulu people further exacerbated the situation, forcing many Zulu into the hands of white employers, thereby becoming a labor pool for the diamond and gold mines. Furthermore, the war significantly influenced the broader trajectory of British imperial policy in southern Africa. The costly and embarrassing initial defeats at Isandlwana forced a re-evaluation of the confederation strategy. While the British ultimately achieved their goal of subjugating the Zulu, the high price paid in lives and prestige made them more cautious about direct military intervention in other parts of the region. Instead, they increasingly relied on indirect rule and political manipulation to achieve their objectives. The experience also underscored the strategic importance of the region, particularly with the subsequent discovery of vast gold reserves in the Witwatersrand in the 1880s. This transformed South Africa from a peripheral interest into a central pillar of the British Empire, leading to further conflicts, most notably the First and Second Boer Wars, which would again test the limits of British military might and colonial ambition. The Anglo-Zulu War, therefore, was not an isolated incident but a crucial stepping stone in the complex and often violent process of establishing British dominance over the entirety of southern Africa. The Anglo-Zulu War stands as a compelling historical narrative, illustrating the profound consequences when an ambitious industrial empire clashes with a formidable, self-reliant indigenous kingdom. Driven by the pursuit of mineral wealth and the strategic vision of confederation, the British Empire, particularly through the aggressive maneuvers of Sir Henry Bartle Frere, deliberately engineered a conflict with the Zulu Kingdom. This imperial overconfidence, rooted in racial bias and an underestimation of Zulu military sophistication, led to the catastrophic British defeat at Isandlwana, shattering the myth of European invincibility and forcing a painful re-evaluation of British military doctrine. While the dramatic defense of Rorke's Drift provided a much-needed morale boost and propaganda victory for the British, it was the subsequent adaptation of tactics, emphasizing fortified positions and concentrated firepower, that ultimately turned the tide at Kambula and Jinjanlova. The decisive victory at Ulundi, achieved through overwhelming force and adapted strategies, marked the military subjugation of the Zulu Kingdom. The aftermath of the war, however, revealed a complex legacy. The British policy of fragmenting Zululand into 13 chiefdoms, intended to pacify the region, instead plunged it into prolonged civil strife, undermining its social and economic cohesion. Yet, paradoxically, this very subjugation fostered a deeper sense of Zulu identity and nationalism, laying groundwork for future resistance movements. For the British, the war, though ultimately a victory, was an expensive and embarrassing affair that highlighted vulnerabilities in their military strategies and prompted reforms in colonial warfare and administration. In its essence, the Anglo-Zulu War served as a brutal laboratory for modern warfare and a template for imperial control. It demonstrated the devastating impact of industrial weaponry against traditional forces and underscored how colonial powers prioritized control and resource extraction over genuine stability. The conflict reshaped the political map of southern Africa, influenced military thinking, and contributed significantly to the complex racial and political landscape that would endure for generations, inextricably linking the war to the later dispossession of land, forced labor systems, and the eventual rise of apartheid. The echoes of this conflict continue to resonate, offering a sobering reflection on the costs and consequences of imperial ambition and the enduring power of a people's will to resist.